More than 200 people have died as a result of the destruction brought by Hurricane Helene since last week. The storm destroyed several communities in North Carolina, and hundreds of people are still missing. But President Joe Biden seemed to forget that the storm had ever happened.
What do the states in the storm zone need, Mr. President?
Okay.
What do the states in the storm zone, what do they need after what you saw today?
Oh, in the storm zone?
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering what storm you're talking about. They're getting everything they need. They're very happy across the board.
That's not great.
I didn't hear what he said either. It sounded like he said storm zone.
But then he said, oh, storm zone. I didn't know which storm you were talking about. Well, the second comment is a bit concerning, no?
No, not at all.
It's not?
There's plenty of storms. I think this is,
Oh,
listen,
come on.
there's legitimate things you can say about Joe Biden. I think when the media starts getting, it's like micro conversations, like pulling little lines out of conversations out of context because they want clicks, they want drama, they want to, death by 1,000 cuts against the Democrats. We could do this with Donald Trump all day long, and he says crazy stuff every minute to the point where that's why in the debate they wanted to just let him run the mic because when he just keeps going, it's so nuts. But Joe Biden's not running for president, as we know. That really wasn't that bad. I literally, as I was listening to this for the first time, I'm like, what did he say? What did he say? And then that's what Joe Biden said.
So my problem with the he's not running for president commentary is he's president right now.
Okay, what do you
right?
want to impeach him?
I don't know. I mean, if he's
step
not
down and give the presidency to Kamala?
If at least she's competent, at least she knows what's
perfect.
happening. I mean, competent's not the right word, but at least she knows what's going on. I mean, I think there's a legitimate point to the fact that since Biden was removed from the top of the ticket, pushed out by Democrats, he has been missing in action. I mean, again, he was at the beach through Sunday night. He did not respond to the storm until Monday morning.
No.
He did not come back to the White House until Monday morning.
He didn't go into the White House till Monday morning, but he, of course, responded to the storm. I mean, FEMA arrived at his will.
Right, but my point is the fact that you can't leave your beach house to go get an in-person briefing, and people want to see when you're a leader that you are going to immediately respond to natural disasters, things that are affecting the American people, that you're going to take it seriously, and not get angry and moan about how you were on the phone when somebody asked you why you weren't at the White House. I mean, his response to that was so uncaring.
This was not a George W. Bush in Hurricane Katrina situation where he's in a helicopter and is just looking at the effects.
Yeah, it's
of
worse.
Hurricane
He didn't
Katrina.
go at all.
And don't forget that you're complaining about one day. Do you know how long it took for
It was 3 days.
George W. Bush to go down there? And then let's not forget Donald Trump and showing up in Puerto Rico for the worst hurricane in history, Category 5, where he threw paper towels at the Puerto Rican people. How did that play? And by the time he showed up, I mean, that was well into the storm. The island had no power for months afterwards. There was no food, water. I mean, literally over 4,500 people died because of the storm. So if we want to talk about disaster relief and how to respond to the needs of a location that's under a disaster, one day, him being a few miles away from D.C., because it really is a few miles away from D.C., let's not forget, it's not that big of a deal. I think it's a nothing burger. He still issued FEMA funds. He still asked them to go.
Well, and Trump did that for Puerto Rico as well.
No, he did that well after for Puerto Rico. And
yeah, well, FEMA hasn't unlocked a lot of the funds. Unfortunately, a lot of them still have not been doled out, which is a serious problem. And I think a reason why people are critical of FEMA, I mean, in this case, for example, with Hurricane Helene, FEMA's facing this funding shortage, and I know we talked about this in a previous segment, that you contend that Republicans voted against funding FEMA because they were opposed to a short-term continuing resolution that funds the government through December because they want a longer-term deal with the Democrats, right? That includes things like the SAVE Act. So if your argument is that Republicans oppose FEMA, then you could say Democrats oppose not allowing illegal immigrants to vote in federal elections because they don't want to make a deal on the SAVE Act.
They're already not allowed to vote. No, it's a
but
waste
an
of time.
ID check, okay. So, I mean, I'm just saying that your argument cuts both ways. So
we're not holding up FEMA funding. The deal that's on the table right now, they're holding up. There is no deal on the table from Republicans.
Well, they did pass the short-term continuing resolution, which does fund FEMA at its current levels through December.
Yes, but that was without those
without additional funds, right?
And over 100 Republican lawmakers voted against it, but they don't have an alternative solution. I mean, this is the continuous problem with Republicans. It's like, we don't want to fund this, we don't want to fund it, we want to do this other deal, but then when they never write it, and then if they do, it's months and months later, and it's not serious, so much so that their own party votes against it.
Well, I agree that Republicans need to do a better job of having very clear what kind of budgetary cuts that they want if they're going to argue for reducing government spending and deficit spending. Some of them do. I think the Freedom Caucus is one of the few groups in the Republican Party that is consistently committed to this idea. And they shouldn't be waiting until the last minute to try to do negotiations. It should happen well ahead of a funding deadline or a government shutdown looming. That being said, I just reject the premise that if you are committed to the principle of reducing government spending and you vote against a bill that massively increases government spending, or you think that a continuing resolution doesn't really address the problem, that because there's one good thing in that bill, that you're somehow against funding that one good thing like FEMA.
But if you're against government spending and you're voting against a bill that funds FEMA, why is it not a good I don't understand how we can't criticize them because they're against government spending, which means that they're not going to...
Not all government spending. They want to cut from certain areas,
but
right?
we don't know which those are because
not FEMA.
They say things all the time that contradict each other.
Like what?
All the time. I mean, Ted
Give me
Cruz
an example.
doesn't... Oh, God, we're pulling up, random things. They don't fund the necessities. That is, they want to fund the military.
Again, like what?
FEMA, Education, Department of Education, border security. They didn't the Bipartisan Border Security Act. There wasn't no alternative act.
There was. It was called HR 2. It was in the House.
It didn't get anywhere because you have to actually
because Democrats aren't serious about border security, and the bipartisan border bill is a sham.
The bipartisan border bill was bipartisan. The alternative
was bipartisan
was a
because Mitch McConnell sent in James Lankford to be a sacrificial lamb to pretend that he cared about the border, which he didn't, and then James Lankford rightfully got skewered because the bill didn't include anything that Republicans actually wanted.
I just don't understand how it is on us when we bring in Republicans, when Democrats bring in Republicans to these bills, and yet a small group, the Freedom Caucus, come on, the Freedom Caucus, you know why their stuff never gets through? Because they are so specific about what they cut, and it's unpopular with the American people, and it's unpopular for the rest of the Republicans in the party, especially those in swing districts, especially those on the border. So, it's you have to work with the other side. We are working with you. If it were up to me, I would want the Green New Deal. But unfortunately, the majority of Democrats don't want the Green New Deal. If it was up to me, I would have much better, more humanitarian border issues. But unfortunately, I'm in a Democratic Party that has a whole array of different types of Democrats. And I have to work with them, and they have to work with Republicans. But the Freedom Caucus wants to work in their own little tribe, and they think that they can hold the country hostage to their own needs. At the end of the day, if you want to fund FEMA, it has to be bipartisan. And they refuse to do so. And now it's going to be an attack ads in these swing districts, and it's potentially going to lose them the election. Ted Cruz is a prime example.
Well, I think, again, it's dishonest to say that they don't want to fund FEMA when literally no one has said that. But there's another issue with your point, which is you're suggesting that people should not represent what their constituents want. Obviously, these constituents want what the Freedom Caucus is selling, otherwise they wouldn't have been voted into office. They have to abandon whatever principles or ideas their constituents want for the sake of basically...
Compromise.
Well, compromise or bipartisanship at the expense of the American people. I mean, bipartisanship is not always a good thing when it leads to bad policy. And unfortunately, we've seen a divorce from both parties, frankly, in terms of what policies are pushed in Congress versus what the American people actually want. There's a research survey done by Barron Group in the past couple of weeks that showed that the Republican Party base has gotten increasingly populist over the past 5 to 10 years. And yet Congress has not followed that trend. They have been stuck in the old ways of the Republican Party that existed before Trump. And I think a lot of people could argue that the Democratic Party has had a similar divorce from its voter base. And so to me, the problem is not that people in Congress don't work together enough. It's that they're working together on the wrong things that most Americans actually don't want. I mean, even if you survey most Americans, most of them agree that government spending is too high. Most of them agree that they don't want a massive deficit. Most of them agree with the basic economic principle that spending too much money leads to inflation. So saying that they're not doing what the American people want, I think is a bit of a misinterpretation. It's that they don't want to do what the Republican and Democrat blob want.
I agree with much of what you're saying in that, yes, the institutional players in our parties, elected and unelected, I'm saying even in the Democratic Party membership, they're beholden to financial interests that really are against populism. So the populism is occurring on both sides of the aisle. Because Americans are hurting, the middle class has been affected. Yes, the economy is better than it's ever been, and inflation is down, and we had an incredible jobs report announced yesterday. With that being said, we still have high credit card debt in our country, higher than ever before. We have student loan debt. People want those problems solved, but both parties are beholden by financial interests that prevent them from doing so. Maybe a little bit, thank goodness we have Kamala Harris, who's putting forward better economic policies that I didn't think were even doable in the Democratic Party 8 years ago. The Inflation Reduction Act was a huge boom towards economic policy. I know we're going to disagree on that, but it was transformative. And those checks that went out that Donald Trump signed that Congress passed were a big deal. But that was in the middle of a crisis. I want Congress to be acting populist when it's not a crisis. I want them to stand up to the financial industry when it's not a crisis. I want them to stand up to the military-industrial complex and the consultants when it's not a crisis. They only take these actions when it's a crisis, but right now, that is why populism has risen. I think it's transforming a bit. Some of these Freedom Caucus members that are supposed populists do take money from the folks.
Yeah, and not all of the Freedom Caucus is populist, I will say. Some of them are basically Tea Party holdovers, which is a different thing.
And Tea Party was backed by the Koch brothers. I mean, come on. Or Koch brother now.
Well, you won't find any Koch brothers support from me. We're going to have to leave it there.
Surprise.
Yeah, we do agree on that. We're going to have to leave it there and be back with more Rising after this.